This is Japanese AutoRacing, an oval motorcycle race with a very weird history. The Mafia was involved, the drivers are locked away from society, and to this day, it's one of the only sports that the Japanese public are allowed to bet on. So what's going on? Let me take you through it because it's kind of bizarre. AutoRacing is what you get when you combine NASCAR, MotoGP, and casino-style gambling. Now, its exact origin is shrouded in mystery, but it all started back in 1950 in Japan, whilst it was still recovering from World War II. People were desperate for recreation, and after enduring a long period of war, Japan was a tough place to live at the time. So one sleepy morning, a bunch of dudes took their stripped out motorcycles to the closest horse racetrack, the Funabashi Raceway, and decided to race around in circles for fun. It was like flat track racing. It turns out that they were onto something because people began to show up to race with them, so they had to organise the races into draws and put together bigger events with every successive competition. In 1961, the Japanese Kirin Auto Race Foundation was established so that races could be organised properly. All the bike frames had to follow a very specific specification and use Triumph twin engines. It was around that time that the foundation presumably saw the rising number of accidents and injuries on the dirt tracks, and so decided to switch from dirt racing to racing on asphalt. The equipment though remained stripped down and simple, making it accessible to people by keeping costs really low. It didn't take long for underground betting rings to form around the races. And this is where the story gets spicy. Enter the Yakuza, an organised crime syndicate from the 1700s, and one of the largest in the world, even to this day. And in the 1960s, the Yakuza were at their peak with over 200,000 members. These guys look like they mean business. The Yakuza began to run the betting rings. Not only did they start to control the betting, but they also began fixing the results. So they bet a lot of money on a weaker rider winning the race, and the odds would be heavily stacked against them. That meant if they won, they would obviously win many times the amount they bet. High risk, high reward. But crucially, they would bribe or persuade the stronger rider, and more likely the winner, to tank the race by crashing or simply not riding fast enough. Job done and cash in. So soon, regular spectators got frustrated with this because they weren't getting to watch any real racing and they would end up losing money to the house. So the whole thing turned into a bit of a sham, really. Unsurprisingly, the sport's popularity dwindled, and in 1967, the Japanese Kirin Auto Race Foundation had had enough. They stepped in to take over and clean up the sport. They legalized and organized the betting so that it was regulated and properly controlled. They would oversee suspicious activity like a huge number of bets placed on one weaker rider, for example, but along with that, they also ensured that the drivers remained locked up and inaccessible to the outside world. More on that later on, but first, let's talk about the races themselves. Auto races in Japan are short, 6-lap events around a 500-meter oval track. And the oval's only very slightly banked at under 3 degrees. For example, Daytona is 31 degrees. The race events normally last about 8 days with 12 races per day. There are 5 venues across Japan where they're held, and they're all in massive stadiums. And the racing is really close, actually. They're often inches from each other, all trying to maintain speed throughout their racing line. And today, auto racers run purpose-built Suzuki AR600 engines. So they're 600cc, that are straight piped, and they sound awesome. They send 59 horsepower and 45 pounds-foot of torque to the rear wheel through a 2-speed gearbox. That may not sound like a lot, but it's enough to take these lightweight racers to nearly 90 miles an hour on the straight sections of this banked asphalt track. And just like NASCAR, everything about the bikes is meant to work at extreme angles while turning left. I mean, just look at those handlebars. They kind of look broken, don't they? But see how when the bikes lean into a turn, they give the rider a good holding position that's parallel to the ground, with the left handle safely off the floor. The tyres too are pretty unique. They're shaved versions of a triangular Dunlop KR73 that are specifically meant for this type of racing. Their shape means they have the largest possible contact patch with the asphalt, and as we know, that leads to better performance. Just look at these MotoGP and dirt bikes, barely managing to keep up with the pace of this simple, purpose-built auto racer, and the MotoGP bikes have more than 4 times the horsepower. And what's mad is that they race with no brakes. But believe it or not, it's the only way to safely race like this, lap after lap. I know it may sound weird, but the brakes mean that the riders have to slow down gradually, coasting with no throttle. It also means that the riders have the confidence to stick incredibly close to each other for laps on end, knowing everyone on track has to hold a smooth and consistent line and can't dart about. In fact, the only way they can slow themselves down to the inside of the corner is by the help of this metal boot that they wear on their left foot. They use it the way that you turn a boat by putting your oar in the water to slow down the direction you wanted to turn in, or what you'd see skateboarders doing with their hands on the floor while turning in a similar manner. Downhill skateboarders. Those guys are nuts. And it's not just the brakes. These bikes have no gauges, starter motors, or rear suspension. In fact, the only suspension on the bike is actually the front fork, which contains nothing more than 2 coil springs, not even dampers. And because the races are so short, the tiny fuel tanks only hold 1.9 litres of fuel. And all of this is done in an effort to simplify the bike and reduce its weight. The lower the weight, the easier it is for the rider to control the lean of the bike, and also the better its acceleration off the line. And it's just like any other motorsport, getting a good start is key. Just watch these riders push their weight forward at the moment of the start to get a sort of catapult effect and more forward momentum to carry into the first turn. Riders actually replace the valves and valve springs every few races in order to get the cleanest possible airflow into the engine and help their standing starts. And yes, they do it all themselves. If you look at these races, you won't see any pit crew. That's because, like the old days of motorsport, the riders are trained to assemble, repair, and rebuild their own bikes on their own. The Japanese have long since had a tradition of, I'm going to butcher this, Jinba Itaya, which refers to a rider and his horse being in perfect harmony. It's Mazda's adopted design philosophy and kind of what these auto racers aspire and train for. They apply for admission into the official training institutes, where they must spend between 9 and 10 months leading a simple military lifestyle. And the training is relentless. They put in between 7,000 and 8,000 laps of practice in wet and dry conditions. And at the end of term, they're ranked and graded. These grades then determine their starting positions for future races. And that's because these races are run on sort of a reverse grid format. The strongest riders start at the back of the grid behind the 1 or 2 handicap lines. And if you're looking closer, you might have noticed that in all these races, they're wearing bright coloured jerseys over a lot of safety padding. And just like the Tour de France, these jersey colours indicate the rider's rating or ranking, with pink going to the strongest of the riders and the slowest wearing the white vest of shame, I call it. Anyway, everything about auto racing is made to make it more friendly to spectators and, of course, gamblers. And gambling is a big part of Japanese culture, and actually even their economy. And more than half of all leisure time in Japan is spent gambling. But the fun and games stop when the gambling begins to interfere with the motorsport results. In fact, even revered sumo wrestlers in Japan are not above the fixing results. After more than a decade of investigation in 2011, more than 23 sumo wrestlers were found guilty of it. And of course, it was all illegal, and those familiar dudes in tattoos, allegedly, had a lot to do with it. But auto racing seems to manage being a gambling sport while staying true to the racing. And the betting all happens through official channels. Spectators get to watch the trial runs and practice sessions and then decide whom to bet on. And the whole thing is pretty legit now. And today, auto racing generates $900 million in gambling money alone. And with a lot of money at stake, the constant threat of illegal betting always lurks. But to keep the racing clean and prevent purposeful crashing, riders must go into insane lengths in order to be able to compete. They spend nearly half a year in isolation, away from their families and the outside world. And they're stuck in a dormitory most of the time. And this is all so they can't be contacted with offers or threats to fix results in races by a bunch of sinister tattooed henchmen. So what kind of crazy do you have to be to want to make these sacrifices, all to ride bikes in a circle for all your life? I mean, look at one of the most popular faces in the sport, Katsuyuki Mori. He's a pop music icon in Japan from a hugely popular group, SMAP. He gave up his hugely successful singing career for auto racing. It turns out there is actually a lot of money to be made in auto racing. The best riders take home millions of dollars a year, and that's second only to the top drivers in the top flights of motorsport. But it's not just for money that these riders race. Auto race riders acquire an almost cult-like following in Japan. They're heroes. And any student at Auto Racing Institute will tell you how much they aspire to be like them, and that's the other amazing thing about this motorsport. Behind the padded jerseys, there could be men, women, or elderly veterans as well. Riding an autocross is open to almost anyone older than 17 years old, no taller than 5'10" and weighing no more than 60 kilos. Some autocross racers are well into their 70s and still going strong. And people in Japan love their auto races. Take a look at some of these beautifully customized auto races, reminiscent of the kind of artwork you'd see in customized American choppers or hot rods. For a motorsport that was once run by the Mafia and largely run on wages, it now is one of the purest and most inclusive ones yet. Thank you very much for watching. You should check out this playlist of other mad motorsports, and I'll catch you in the next one.